She walked into the bank expecting business as usual, just another day in another branch. But what she heard before she even reached the counter stopped her cold. Someone was crying. What would you do if you uncovered something that wasn't meant for your eyes? Let us know in the comments section below. Bianca Miller adjusted the strap of her handbag as she stepped through the glass doors of Brooklyn Trust and Security's Harrison Avenue branch. The lobby was sleek, well-lit, and exactly as corporate branding dictated, clean, professional, welcoming. But something about it felt wrong. She wasn't sure what it was at first. Maybe it was the way the tellers stood behind the counter, stiff as mannequins, each movement rehearsed and cautious. Maybe it was the way the air carried an unnatural hush, as if the very walls held their breath. Or maybe it was the bank's manager, Peter Calloway, perched near the back, watching the floor like a predator surveying his territory. Bianca had been in the financial industry long enough to recognize tension when she saw it, and this branch was suffocating under it. She stepped toward the line, blending in effortlessly as just another customer. She wore a navy blazer over a simple blouse and slacks, her hair in a neat bun. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was the CEO of the entire company, and that was the point. The best way to learn the truth about an environment was to experience it without the weight of her title overshadowing everything. As she approached the teller counter, she heard a muffled sob. It was faint, barely noticeable over the quiet hum of customer chatter and the faint tapping of keyboards. But Bianca had spent years honing her instincts, and they screamed at her now. Someone was upset. Her eyes flicked toward the break room door, slightly ajar, just past the teller stations. A young woman stood just inside, partially hidden from the main floor, her head bowed, fingers clenched into the fabric of her blouse. Bianca didn't need to see her face to recognize someone desperately trying to hold it together. The nameplate on the nearby workstation read, Camille Hayes. Bianca watched as Camille wiped at her face quickly, straightened her posture, and forced herself back onto the floor with a weak smile. But her eyes, red-rimmed and filled with lingering distress, betrayed her. Bianca stepped forward, choosing Camille's window on purpose. "Good morning," she said, watching the young teller carefully. Camille hesitated for just a second too long before responding. "Hi, welcome to Brooklyn Trust and Security. How can I help you today?" She had the voice of someone trying to sound normal while standing on unsteady legs. Bianca offered a kind smile. "No rush. Take your time." Camille blinked, startled by the unexpected patience. Customers rarely noticed when tellers were on edge. They came, made transactions, and left. No one stopped to really see the people behind the counter. For a fleeting moment, Camille's lips parted, as if she wanted to say something important, but then her gaze flicked to the side. Bianca followed, her eyes. Peter Calloway. The branch manager was stationed near the offices, speaking to another employee, but his presence loomed over the entire floor. The second Camille noticed him, her shoulders tensed. That's when Bianca knew. Whatever had Camille in tears, it wasn't a customer. It was internal. "Everything all right?" Bianca asked softly. Camille's eyes snapped back to her, startled by the question. "Yes, of course," she said quickly. "Would you like to make a deposit or withdrawal today?" The words came out on autopilot, a script. Bianca could push. She could lean in and press for an answer. But Camille wasn't ready, and Bianca knew better than to force it. Instead, she handed over a check and said, "Deposit, please." Camille nodded and began processing the transaction, her hands still trembling slightly as she typed. Bianca kept her expression neutral, but inside, she was taking notes. She needed to get more information. As Camille handed her receipt back, Bianca glanced at the teller beside her. Isaiah Lopez, according to his nameplate. He was young, mid-20s, and wary. His eyes darted toward Camille once, then toward Peter, before quickly looking back at his own station. He knew something. Bianca took her receipt and casually stepped aside, lingering just within earshot of the tellers. She pretended to check her phone as she listened. "You good?" Isaiah whispered to Camille once Bianca was out of direct line of sight. Camille nodded stiffly, forcing another fake smile. Yeah, I'm fine. Isaiah didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. Instead, he focused on his own work, keeping his head down. Bianca frowned. Whatever was going on here, people were too afraid to talk about it. She needed to try a different approach. Stepping back toward the tellers, she feigned hesitation, as if she had forgotten something. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Isaiah this time. He looked up. "Yes, ma'am?" Bianca smiled warmly. "I had a question. If I needed to set up a business account, who would I speak to?" Isaiah hesitated. "That would be Mr. Calloway," he said carefully. "He's our branch manager." "Of course. Would you recommend him?" Bianca asked lightly. Isaiah stiffened just slightly before catching himself. "He's experienced." Bianca raised an eyebrow. Not exactly a glowing endorsement. Before she could say anything else, a voice cut in, sharp, authoritative. "Can I help you with something?" Bianca turned to find Peter Calloway watching her. Up close, he was every bit as unpleasant as she expected. Early 50s, graying at the temples, the type of man who smiled only when necessary and always with a hint of condescension. His suit was immaculate, but there was something in his stance that set her on edge, a self-satisfied arrogance. Bianca smiled back, effortlessly matching his energy. "I was just asking about setting up a business account. Isaiah was helping me." Peter's eyes flicked toward Isaiah, a quick warning glance before settling back on Bianca. "I'd be happy to assist you personally. Step into my office." The words were polite. The tone was not a request. Bianca nodded, playing along. Of course. As she followed Peter toward his office, she caught one last look at Camille, still standing behind her station, still holding herself together by a thread. Bianca had been a leader long enough to recognize when a workplace had gone rotten from the inside out, and she had a gut feeling. This was just the beginning. Bianca sat in the stiff leather chair across from Peter Calloway, keeping her expression neutral as he settled behind his desk. The office was meticulously neat, not a single paper out of place. A row of plaques adorned the back wall, awards for branch performance and customer service, the kind of decorations designed to impress, but told her nothing about the man sitting across from her. Peter leaned forward slightly, lacing his fingers together. "So, you're interested in opening a business account?" Bianca tilted her head slightly, as if considering. "I am," she said smoothly. "I've been researching different banks, but I like to see things up close before making a decision." Peter smiled. A forced, practiced thing. "We pride ourselves on personal relationships here at Brooklyn Trust and Security. We believe in taking care of our clients like family." Bianca held back a scoff. If that was true, his family looked scared to breathe without permission. She glanced toward the glass panel beside his office door. From this angle she could see Camille back at her station, her posture rigid, her hands fidgeting. She wasn't talking to customers, just staring at the computer screen, like she was trying to disappear. Bianca turned back to Peter. "Your team seems well trained. How long have they been here?" Peter's expression barely flickered, but something in his posture shifted. "We have a strong retention rate. A few new hires here and there, of course." Bianca nodded. "Camille, seems new." Peter blinked. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Bianca caught it. "Yes, she joined us about 4 months ago." "And how is she doing?" Peter's lips pressed together briefly before stretching back into his polite mask. "She's adjusting." Bianca didn't miss the way he chose his words carefully. "She seems a little nervous," Bianca continued, watching for his reaction. "Maybe just finding her footing?" Peter leaned back slightly, the air around him shifting from polite to slightly irritated. "She's still learning," he said, his tone a little clipped now. "We have high standards here. Some people struggle with that." Struggle. Bianca knew what that meant in corporate speak. It meant the problem wasn't the system, it was the individual's failure to endure it. She smiled politely, giving a slow nod. I understand. I used to work in banking myself. Peter's interest piqued at that. He leaned forward slightly. Really? Which institution? Bianca tilted her head, pretending to hesitate. A few different places. You know how it is. Moving up the ranks, testing different environments. His smile returned, but it wasn't warm. It was more calculating. Then you know how demanding this business can be. I do, she agreed. I also know that leadership determines a lot about a branch's culture. Peter nodded as if he agreed, but his eyes flicked toward the glass panel again, out to his employees. A strong hand keeps everything in order, he said. Bianca took that in, then casually placed her hands on the desk. How late do your tellers usually stay after hours? Peter's jaw tightened. Why do you ask? Just curious, she said smoothly. I noticed Camille was still here when I was leaving earlier. Peter's face remained unreadable. Occasionally. Newer tellers need extra coaching. Nothing unusual. Liar. Bianca smiled again and stood. I appreciate your time, Mr. Calloway. I'll take this into consideration. Peter stood as well, offering a handshake. His grip was firm, controlled, like a man who liked having control. Bianca stepped out of his office and back onto the main floor. She kept her pace even, her expression unreadable, but inside, her mind was racing. She needed more information. As she passed by the teller line, she glanced toward Camille again, but this time it was Isaiah's gaze she caught. He was watching her, not in an obvious way, but cautiously. She walked toward the exit, but at the last second, she veered slightly and stopped at the side where Isaiah was stationed. Excuse me, she said quietly. He looked up, wary. Bianca lowered her voice. I just had a meeting with Mr. Calloway. He said Camille sometimes stays late for extra coaching. Isaiah's face remained neutral, but his eyes told a different story. Unease, hesitation. Did he? Bianca nodded, watching him closely. That normal? Isaiah hesitated just a beat too long before responding. Not really. That was all she needed. She gave him a small, knowing nod and walked out. She needed to talk to someone outside of work. That evening, Bianca returned to the area and found herself outside a small cafe a few blocks from the bank. She had done her research. Isaiah often grabbed coffee here after work. She spotted him as he walked in, still dressed in his work attire. He ordered his drink, then sat at a table near the window, scrolling through his phone. Bianca approached casually. Mind if I join you? Isaiah looked up, startled, but quickly masked it. Sure. She sat down and leaned forward slightly. I'm going to be honest with you, Isaiah. I know something's wrong in that branch. Isaiah tensed. I don't know what you mean. Bianca sighed. I'm not a customer. I'm not looking for a business account. My name is Bianca Miller, and I'm the CEO of Brooklyn Trust and Security. Isaiah's breath caught. His eyes widened, darting around as if expecting someone to overhear. You're joking. I'm not. Bianca pulled out her phone, showed him her company profile, her name, her title. The realization hit him like a freight train. He exhaled slowly. Holy shit. He stopped himself, lowering his voice. You really her? She nodded. I don't make a habit of introducing myself this way, but I need the truth. What's going on with Camille? Isaiah glanced toward the window, then back at her. He hesitated, but Bianca could see it in his eyes. He wanted to tell her. Finally, he sighed. She's terrified. Bianca's stomach tightened. Because of Peter? Isaiah nodded. It's not just the late hours. He corners her, says things to her when no one's around. Makes her feel like she owes him for keeping her job. Bianca's hands curled into fists beneath the table. He singles her out, Isaiah continued. She tried to brush it off at first, but it's getting worse. She's afraid to say no. She's afraid to report him. Bianca's jaw clenched. Has anyone else noticed? Isaiah hesitated. Dominique has. He tried to speak up once. Peter made his life hell after that. Bianca inhaled deeply, forcing herself to stay calm. This ends now. Isaiah swallowed hard. If Peter finds out I told you? Bianca looked him in the eye. Peter won't be in that branch much longer. Isaiah stared at her, processing the weight of that statement. Then, slowly, he nodded. Bianca stood, her expression set in stone. She had everything she needed. Now, it was time to act. Bianca sat in her car outside the Harrison Avenue branch, fingers tapping against the steering wheel as she took a steadying breath. The streetlights flickered against the windshield, illuminating the bank's glass doors, where employees trickled out one by one, locking up for the night. But not everyone was leaving. Isaiah had been right. Through the windows she could see Camille still inside, alone, her posture stiff as she stood by the counter, her hands nervously clasped together. Across from her, Peter Calloway loomed, speaking to her in a tone too low to hear. Bianca clenched her jaw. This was it. This was proof. She reached for her phone, her other hand tightening around the door handle, ready to step in if she had to. Inside, Camille nodded stiffly to something Peter said, forcing a polite smile. Her shoulders were hunched in, her entire body language screaming discomfort. Peter took a step closer. Bianca's pulse spiked. She opened the car door and strode toward the entrance, her heels clicking against the pavement. There was no hesitation anymore. As she pulled the door open, the sound made Peter glance over his shoulder. His expression darkened for just a second before smoothing into feigned surprise. "Miss?" He trailed off, his voice attempting politeness. Bianca shut the door behind her, locked it. Camille visibly exhaled, her eyes darting to Bianca in both confusion and relief. Peter's brow furrowed. "We're closed." Bianca didn't acknowledge him. She turned directly to Camille. "Are you all right?" Camille hesitated. Then, for the first time since Bianca had met her, she didn't force a smile. She just shook her head. Peter's expression hardened. "Excuse me, but I don't see how this concerns you." Bianca turned to him, her face unreadable. "It concerns me, Peter, because I sign your paychecks." Silence. Peter's mouth opened slightly, his expression freezing mid-smirk as the words settled. Camille's eyes widened. Bianca stepped forward, her voice smooth but firm. "I know exactly who you are, and more importantly, I know exactly what you've been doing." Peter let out a short, breathy laugh, but there was no amusement in it, more like disbelief. "This is ridiculous," he scoffed, his mask slipping just a little. "Is it?" Bianca tilted her head. "Because I know you've been keeping Camille late. I know you've been cornering her. I know you've been making her afraid to say no." Bianca blinked at say. Camille pressed a hand to her mouth, shoulders shaking. Peter's face twisted, his attempt at feigned innocence evaporating. "You can't just walk in here making accusations," he snapped. "You're overstepping, and I don't appreciate it." Bianca's expression didn't change. "And I don't appreciate managers abusing their power." Peter scoffed, shaking his head. "This is absurd. Do you have any proof? Because unless you do, I suggest you leave before you embarrass yourself." Bianca smiled. She had been waiting for that. She pulled her phone from her pocket and held it up. The screen displayed a live call. "To be honest, Peter, I don't need proof," she said, her voice calm. "But I have it anyway." Peter stared at the phone, his lips parted as he realized what she was saying. Bianca's voice remained level. "You're on speakerphone with Human Resources. Everything you've said, every excuse you've just made, it's already on record." Peter's face went pale. Bianca turned the phone slightly, letting Camille see the name on the screen. The young woman let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. "Camille," Bianca said gently, "you don't have to stay quiet anymore." Camille looked between them, her breath ragged, years of fear colliding into this moment. Finally, she lifted her chin. "I didn't want to stay late," she whispered. "He made me feel like I had to." Peter whipped toward her, his mask crumbling. "Oh, for God's sake, Camille, don't start acting like some victim." Bianca moved between them in a flash. The warning in her eyes was unmistakable. "Dangerous." Peter faltered, realizing too late that he was trapped. "You're done," Bianca said softly. "Security is on the way. You can either walk out calmly, or they can remove you." Peter's jaw locked. His eyes darted toward Camille, then back to Bianca, then back toward the locked doors. He had no options left. Finally, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "This is insane." "No," Bianca corrected. "What you did was insane." The front doors swung open and 2 security personnel stepped in. Peter stepped back instinctively, his face burning red with rage. "I want my lawyer," he bit out. Bianca gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Then I suggest you call him, because you'll be hearing from ours." Security stepped forward, flanking him. Peter stiffened, then finally turned toward the exit. Camille let out a breath she had probably been holding for months. As Peter was led out the door, Bianca turned back to her. "You're safe now." Camille blinked quickly, her eyes filling with relief. She let out a laugh. "The kind that happens when someone is so overwhelmed, they don't know what else to do." Bianca placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We'll talk more tomorrow, but for tonight, go home, rest." Camille nodded, her lip trembling. "Thank you." Bianca gave her a small smile. "Don't thank me. This never should have happened to you in the first place." She turned toward Isaiah, who had appeared near the back, watching everything unfold with cautious hope. She met his eyes. "It's over." Zaya exhaled, nodding slowly. The branch felt different now, lighter, like the tension had finally cracked apart. Bianca took a deep breath, already knowing what she had to do next. Tomorrow, she wasn't just going to clean up this branch. She was going to make sure it never happened again. Anywhere. The morning after Peter Calloway's removal, Bianca Miller walked into the Harrison Avenue branch not as an undercover customer, but as the CEO of Brooklyn Trust and Security. There was no disguise today, no pretense, no observing from the shadows. Today, she was here to rebuild. Employees looked up as she stepped inside, their faces filled with curiosity, apprehension, and in some cases, relief. They had likely heard what had happened the night before. Rumors traveled fast, especially when it involved the abrupt removal of their branch manager. Bianca stopped just inside the doorway and let her gaze sweep across the lobby. It felt different now. Lighter, but not yet healed. Camille was behind the counter, standing a little straighter than the day before. Isaiah and Dominic stood nearby, whispering about something, but quickly quieted when they noticed her arrival. She stepped forward. "Morning, everyone." A few mumbled greetings followed, uncertain, waiting for what came next. She didn't waste time. "I imagine you all have questions," she said, her voice clear and steady. "So let's not dance around it. Peter Calloway has been officially terminated from Brooklyn Trust and Security. There is a full investigation underway regarding his conduct, and I encourage anyone with relevant information to come forward." A hush fell over the room. Some employees exchanged glances. Others kept their heads down, still wary. Bianca wasn't surprised. Fear didn't disappear overnight. She turned toward Camille. "Would you like to step into my office?" Camille hesitated, glancing at the others. Then, slowly, she nodded. They walked together toward the branch manager's former office. When the door shut behind them, Camille let out a small breath. "You okay?" Bianca asked, pulling out a chair for her. Camille sat, pressing her palms against her knees. "I think so. I never expected any of this to happen." Bianca took the seat across from her. "I know it's overwhelming, but I need you to know that you did nothing wrong. What Peter did wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. You had every right to speak up. Camille swallowed hard. I wanted to, but every time I thought about it, She trailed off, shaking her head. I thought maybe I was overreacting, that I was making it worse in my head. Bianca's expression softened. That's exactly what men like him count on. That you'll doubt yourself, that you'll stay quiet because it's easier than risking your job. Camille nodded, looking down. And I did, for months. But not forever, Bianca said firmly, and that's what matters. Camille let out a slow breath. What happens now? We conduct a full review of branch policies, Bianca said. I'm bringing in HR, as well as an independent consultant to evaluate how this was allowed to continue for so long. Every employee will have the opportunity to speak freely, no fear of retaliation. Camille nodded again, slower this time. Most importantly, Bianca continued, you are not alone in this. You have support, and if you need time off, resources, or anything else, name it. For the first time, Camille gave a small smile. Thank you? Bianca returned it, then stood. Come on, I think the rest of the staff needs to hear from you too. Camille looked uncertain but nodded. Together they walked back out to the lobby, where the rest of the team was still lingering, waiting for what came next. Bianca turned to face them. There's one more thing I need you all to understand, she said. Toxic workplaces don't happen overnight, and they don't happen without a system that allows them to thrive. She let that settle before continuing. Brooklyn Trust and Security has to do better. I have to do better. Isaiah shifted slightly, his hands in his pockets. You didn't know. Bianca met his gaze. That's the problem, Isaiah. I should have. A murmur moved through the room. Some nodded. Others just listened. This isn't just about one bad manager, Bianca continued. It's about creating a culture where people feel safe, where no one has to sit in silence, afraid of losing their job because they spoke up. That starts today. The room was quiet, but this time it wasn't because of fear. It was because they were listening. Dominic raised a hand slightly. Does this mean the undercover visits aren't stopping? Bianca smiled. Not by a long shot. There were a few chuckles, some nervous, some genuinely amused. Isaiah exhaled, shaking his head. You really came in here like a secret shopper? Camille let out a soft laugh, surprising even herself, and then wrecked Peter's whole world. Bianca smirked. I wouldn't say wrecked, just redirected. The tension in the room lifted just a little more. They weren't fully healed, not yet. But for the first time, Bianca saw something shift in the way they stood, the way they looked at each other. Hell, it would take time. It would take more than words, but it was a start. And Bianca had every intention of following through. As she left the branch that afternoon, she made a silent promise to herself. This wouldn't be the last time she walked into one of her banks undercover. Because this time she knew what to listen for.